Hi and welcome back. In this video we're talking about debugging, particularly using the Pycharm debugger. The term debugging actually comes from one of the first computers that was built. You know, computers back in the days were massive behemoths taking up entire rooms, and their cabling was actually just exposed. And it turns out that a moth flew into one of the cables and some of the transistors there, and it caused the short circuit, and hence the term debugging was coined. It is actually removing bugs from the cables, or in our case from the code, so that our programs don't crash and don't perform badly. So we're going to try to remove any bugs from, say, our program here. And let's imagine that our bug is that we have misspelled this metrics click, and it should be clicks, because that's what the data is like. So let's imagine we don't know that, and we're trying to find out what this problem could be like, or what this bug could be caused by. Naturally, we have a nice exception handling here, but as you can see, we've not re-raised the exception, so all we're going to see is incorrect values provided. We're going to look through our code and so forth, and we're not going to find anything, so we eventually reach the point where we have to debug. To debug, what to do is to make sure that the correct file is selected, right-click it, and press debug. Now, debugging is just going to run your application, your file, as normal. So right now, if we right-click and debug, it's going to load up. It's going to be a bit slower than just running the application because there's a few more things happening in the background, and then we're going to see incorrect values provided to our calculation function, because of course we got that key error caused by the incorrect key being used there. Now, if we weren't able to realize that this is misspelled, we might decide to set a breakpoint. A breakpoint allows our program to stop at any point, and we can check values of things, and we can run functions and see what breaks. So this error here is raised by the perform calculation function. We know that because it's the only thing that's running in this line. So we know that this is the thing that must be causing the error. Otherwise, it would not be caught by this key error here, exception. So we can set a breakpoint, and in order to do that, just go over to the left here beside line 13 and just click it. Then a red circle will appear, the line will go red, and this tells you that you've set a breakpoint on line 13. Let's run the debugger again. You can either right-click and press debug user score, or now that this has just recently ran, you can press the wee bug icon here, or of course you can go to the top right and press the bug icon. Make sure that the right thing is selected, user score, in order to do that. Now we can see that our program has stopped. And it stopped here at the breakpoint. The line is now blue. That tells us this is the current line that we're running. The line has not ran yet. So we have stopped just before the line. The breakpoints will always stop just before the line. We can see that our user parameter here has a value of user Rolf. We cannot select this text here. Think of it as some floating info. It just tells you what the value of the variables in scope currently are. It's really handy. And notice how this uses that repr function. Earlier on when we talked about repr and str functions, I told you the repr function was most useful for development purposes. And this is why. Because whenever you see a variable, Pycharm is going to show you the repr of that variable when it's telling you the values of it. Now, if you open the debugger tab here on the left, which may be open by default, you'll see a bunch of stuff, and it can be pretty scary the first time you see it. The most important part here is these variables and these buttons up here. The variables once again tell you what variables you've currently got in scope. Inside this function, we only have one variable, that's the user parameter. Here, you can also open it up using this triangle, and then it tells you all the properties of the user at this point in time, currently, before we've executed this function here. Remember, this function is meant to update the user's score, but it's not ran yet, so it's still 0, as it should be from the init method that was called earlier on. You've also got the engagement metrics, which is a dictionary. You can open that, and it tells you the clicks key, and the hits key, and the values. And you can also open up the name, and you can see that it's Rolf. You get a lot of information from these things, including their types, dict, int, str, the length of the dictionary, and you get these numbers here that you don't have to worry about for now. So we now know that on running this function, an error is going to happen. We know that because this error was being caught on this line, and that's the only function that's running. So there are a few things we can do. The first thing I would do when encountering this thing here is to use the calculator. This is the expression evaluator, and what that's used for is running any arbitrary Python code. We're going to select the entire thing after the equal sign, that's perform calculation, including user.engagement metrics. Just select it. Don't need to copy it or anything, and then press the calculator icon. Now you've got the expression evaluator, and it's pasted in the thing that you've just selected. So that's perform calculation with user.engagement metrics as the argument. You can run this code. Let's press evaluate. And notice how now we get this key error, click. That's pretty cool. The console, which is, by the way, behind here on this console tab, does not show anything. It doesn't catch the error or anything like that, because this is a completely separate runtime, if you wish. So this is not running our program. This is just running this function here completely separately, using the data that you've got in your scope. That's why you can use the user variable here. And we get a key error, which is click. So now we've got a bit more information. We know that the click property is incorrect. Okay, let's say that that doesn't tell us enough information, and we want to stop here inside this line just to look at what the metrics object is. Well, there are two ways you can do that. You can set a breakpoint in that line, and remember the breakpoint is going to make you stop right before the line executes, so the error won't have happened yet when you stop at this breakpoint. And if you set a breakpoint there, you can press continue, resume program execution. That's this icon over here, the play icon. You can press that, and that's just going to continue your program until the next breakpoint, or until it terminates if you don't have a breakpoint. So you can set a breakpoint and press continue. Another option is for us to use these buttons here. These are really useful. The first one here steps over to the next line in the file. So what's the next line after this one? Not the next line that will run, but the next line in this scope. The next line will be this print, because the exception is going to be raised by this function here, this line. So when we raise the exception, we're going to go into the except. I'll show you exactly what happens. See, we go into the except, nothing happens here, of course, and then we can step over again, and now we are inside the except block. Step over moves on to the next line in the current scope, in the current block. So it'll just go over into the next one. If you're within a function, it'll stay within that function. If you are in a class, it'll stay within that class, and so forth. Now, we are already too late. The error has already happened, so we're no longer going to be able to go back here. If we now set a breakpoint inside this line and we press continue, we already passed that. So what we're going to do is this breakpoint here is going to get ignored, and we're just going to resume the program execution until the end. Let's press continue now. And as you can see, the program continues, the blue lines disappear, and the console now has this little small yellow arrow there that tells you that, hey, new console output has happened since you last saw this tab. When you click on it, it disappears, and now you can see the output of your program. Incorrect values provided to our calculation function. Nothing new there. I'm going to remove the breakpoint on line 22 and run the program again, debug the program again. And once again, we will stop at our original breakpoint in line 13. Except now we're going to go into step into. Step into takes us into the function that we're running in that line. If we're running multiple functions, it'll take us into the first function that runs on that line. But here, we're only running one function, so step into takes us into the function, and now this line is blue. This is the line we're currently running. Notice how now the metrics parameter here, we also get the contents of it. Clicks is 61 and hits is 100. For me, this is as far as I would have to go, of course, before noticing that clicks and click are completely different strings. There's an S missing there. And so then you would just change this to an S and you would rerun the program. Change it to an S. Notice how now that disappears because we've made a change, and you can just rerun the program by pressing this button here on the left. Now we are back at our perform calculation breakpoint. We can step over in order to move over to the next line, and now we know that we should move into the else line. And that's what happens indeed. Because there's nothing there on the else, it just moves on to the next line that actually does something, which is this if. Now here we've got the user.score, which was set by this line above. If we open up user, we can see that the score is 505. So my 502 earlier on was completely wrong. It's 505, but it is greater than 500. So once again, we can step over, and that will take us into the next line in this function, which is send engagement notification. Now that we're here, we know that we are going to send the engagement notification because this is the function that's about to run. If you want, you can step into, and that takes you into the send engagement notification function. Potentially, if this was doing something more interesting, you could, of course, have a look at it. And if you want, you can select this F string entirely. You can run the calculator and evaluate it and see what it's going to give you. This is totally fine, and a lot of the development is happening on the debugger when I'm at work. You're constantly sort of debugging and making small changes, running the calculator to see exactly what do I want to include in this function. Once you've figured it out with the calculator, just put it in. And that simplifies development quite a bit. And by the way, this button here, step out, takes you to whatever function called you, where you are right now. So if you step out, now you are here, but this function has already ran. So that's important. Now in this line, you are after the function, not before it. So if you were to step over, now you would exit the function entirely. And you go back to right after the function that you called, which brought you into there. I'm going to remove this breakpoint, by the way. So now we are after this function. If we press step over, we're going to end the program. And as you can see, all the blue lines disappear. And now we see in the console the notification that was sent to our user. So once again, I'm just going to debug the program with the breakpoint to give you an overview of what we've seen. And what we've seen is that we can set breakpoints, and that causes our program to stop when we are in debug mode, not when we are in normal play mode. If you are in normal play mode, breakpoints are going to be ignored. So you can set a breakpoint by clicking on the line, and that's going to stop your program there. You've got access to all of the variables in the current scope, and Pycharm is nice enough to give you their values there, but you can also see them down here in the variables tab. And you can open them up and you can have a look at them and so forth. You've got the calculator icon on which you can run any arbitrary Python function you want. Or indeed, you can just look at values of things, like you can type user and that's going to give you the user values. And you can also modify values if you want. You can say user.score equals 200. This returns none, but now you can see down here in your variable that your user variable now has a score of 200. And it's blue to tell you it's just changed between now and the last time you pressed one of these buttons. Down here you've got your threads, and I wouldn't worry too much about this. It's just the trace of where you've been. So you entered this function in here. This is the function that called the function you're currently in. And this here is the function that called your file. This here is the function that called your file, and so forth. So as you can see, Python here, these with a yellow background, by the way, are the ones that you didn't write. These are Python. And there's something here about setting up a debugger and running it and so forth. Nothing you have to worry about, but nonetheless, these things are what called your file originally. You'll normally be interested only on the ones with a white background. That's these two. This is the first line that ran in your program, related to where you are now. And this is the second line, the one where you are now. Of course, we've looked at restarting, continuing, which goes on to the next breakpoint if there is one, or until the program finishes. You can, of course, stop, and that just terminates your program. And you can step over, which goes on to the next line in this function. You can step into, which goes into the next function that runs, in this case, perform calculation. And you can step out, and that brings you from a function out into the function that called you, or right after it. There's a few more buttons there. Feel free to experiment with them. There's nothing that you have to worry too much about. Those are really the main ones. And when you're debugging, make sure to go slowly. Set breakpoints. Look at values. Run functions to make sure that they are doing what you expect. And that way, you're going to be able to deal with errors and any problems in your programs really, really easily. Most of the time is spent debugging. So just remember that. Don't treat this as a sort of secondary thing that you only do when you're in trouble. Use it and love it, and I promise it will pay off. So that's it for this video. I just wanted to show you how to debug using Pycharm. So I'll see you on the next one.